Hello, everyone. For those of you who joined us for one or more of the previous days of this three-day symposium, welcome back to day 3. My name is John Sivey. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry at Towson University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our third discussion panel on the topic of preparing successful applications for faculty positions at PUIs. Our goal is to help share as much insider information as we can about the application process, and as are being able to sort of communicate to you all what are the characteristics of a competitive application. How can you, as a prospective applicant, convert an application into an interview and an interview into a job offer is sort of our overall goal here. At this point, it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists for today's session. And so I'd like to start, we'll go in alphabetical order, with Dr. Ryan Casey, who's a professor and chairperson of the Department of Chemistry at Towson University. Dr. Casey, would you mind telling us a little bit about your academic background and how you arrived at where you're at now?
I would be happy to. John, thanks for inviting me for this today. Hi, everybody. I have a bachelor's in chemistry from Virginia Tech and then earned a PhD in environmental toxicology from Clemson. So I started in a traditional disciplinary area, but I've really been involved in a lot of interdisciplinary work over my career. I've been at Towson. This is my 21st year. So I started here as a newbie assistant professor and worked up through the ranks. And while I've been here, I've taught courses in introductory chemistry. I teach a senior level undergraduate course in toxicology. I've taught non-science majors, and graduate level environmental chemistry courses. And I'm involved both in the Department of Chemistry as well as in the Environmental and Science and Studies program, which is an interdisciplinary program. So I've had opportunities to serve on searches, both that are traditional disciplinary searches within my department, as well as interdisciplinary searches that support the environmental science program. So I've really seen a variety of different approaches to establishing a career. And I came out of a PhD program where the name of the department I was applying to was not a given. I could have been applying to a number of different types of programs with an interdisciplinary degree like I had. So that's one of my perspectives that I hope to be able to share with you all today. And now, having come up through the ranks, I've served in a lot of search committees, and as department chair, it gives me another perspective on faculty hiring and recruiting, because again, don't forget, we're trying to hire people who are qualified and going to be successful as well. So just as much as you all are trying to understand how to best position yourself to be hired, we're constantly working on how to recruit highly qualified faculty to come into our programs. So glad to see you all and look forward to talking with you further.
Thank you very much, Dr. Casey. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the second department chairperson on our panel today, Dr. Laura Goff, who is a professor and chair in the Department of Biological Sciences at Towson University. Dr. Goff, please tell us a little bit about your academic journey so far.
Thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I'm a plant ecologist, and I mainly work in wetlands, and for the last 20 plus years in Arctic tundra. My bachelor's degree was in biology from Brown University, and my PhD was in botany from Louisiana State University. Towson is actually my third stop in my faculty journey. So my first faculty position was at University of Alabama, and my second was at University of Texas at Arlington. Both of those universities I call R2s, because they're not R1s, they don't have that much research going on, but they are PhD granting. I then moved to Towson in 2015, and I came in as chair, so I arrived here as department chair. I teach, over my career, I've taught a lot of different courses. At the undergraduate level, I've taught botany, biodiversity, plant ecology. I've taught non-majors biology to 300 freshmen at University of Alabama. That was whole different experience. I've taught graduate courses in community ecology, wetlands ecology, global change biology. Here at Towson, I supervise master's students both in biology and, like Ryan said, in environmental science. So I do span into that interdisciplinary program as well. And I have seen, as a student, I was at an R1, as a faculty member, I've been at an R2, and now being at Towson, where we're sort of in between we are a PUI, I guess, technically still, but we're right on the cusp because we do have a master's program. We're sort of in between. So I've certainly seen a bunch of different fields or different kinds of universities, and I'm glad to provide comments about those later if people have questions. That's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goff. And one of the things that has come up in some of the previous discussions, just for the benefit of the panelists, is this idea that not all PUIs are created equal, and there's this spectrum of different experiences, and that has informed our conversation of what the academic triad of research, teaching, and service looks like, and it can be quite diverse depending on where you land. And so, Dr. Goff, we're grateful for the multiple perspectives you're going to be able to bring from the different institutions that you've been a part of. Our third panelist today is Dr. Claire Mujoro, who's the Director of Competitive Fellowships and Awards in the Office of the Provost at Towson University, and also a Professor of Chemistry. Dr. Mujoro, would you please share with us about your academic journey?
Yes, thanks so much, Dr. Sivey. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all. And I'm really looking forward to the conversations that we're going to have this afternoon. So my journey, as the other faculty members have described, is also, I guess, has been circuitous in a way. I got my bachelor's degree upstate New York in chemistry at St. Lawrence University, and then I went to Yale University, where I earned my PhD in organometallic chemistry. Towson University is my second stop in my career as a professor. My first position was at a PUI in Pennsylvania, Shippensburg University, and I obtained tenure and promotion there, and then moved to Towson to get tenure and promotion a second time. So that's an interesting story that we might talk about later on. And have been at Towson University for 15 years. I've taught general chemistry, inorganic chemistry, organometallic chemistry, and currently teaching mostly organic chemistry at Towson. My research has evolved in a couple of directions. I have a project in organometallic chemistry, looking at homogeneous catalysis, hydroboration reactions using titanium catalysts. And I also have a research project in environmental organic chemistry, where we look at degradation pathways of carbamate pesticides in tropical environments. As part of that second research project, I developed an interest in science policy and applied for a AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science Fellowship, which posted me at the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is part of the State Department, for 2 years, and that appointment became a 6-year appointment as a senior science advisor there. So I did start working in the area of science policy and science diplomacy on the global arena in that position. And that sort of opened up another research interest in that space, and has sort of led organically to the position that I have now in the Office of the Provost, where I'm working closely with students to support and prepare them to submit competitive applications to prestigious national and international awards. In terms of service on searches, and I think this is what you're going to hear from all of us, we've all had quite a bit of experience on search committees. I'm currently chairing a search, actually, for an organic chemist. Again, I'll stop there. I'm sure we're going to have opportunities to talk a lot more about many of these points. And again, thank you so much, John, for the opportunity to share my experience with this group.
Thanks so much for being here, Claire. Our fourth panelist is Dr. Vonnie Shields, who is the Associate Dean in the Fisher College of Science and Mathematics and a Professor of Biology at Towson University. Dr. Shields, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here today, and I hope I can be a good resource to be able to answer a lot of your questions. Unlike the other candidates, or the people that you've heard from so far, I had most of my undergraduate and doctoral studies in Canada. So I came from quite a different, well, I guess it was really, really cold there. So, I mean, when I experienced the kind of climate change, I would say, when I went into my postdoctoral studies, it was quite a difference. But going back to my bachelor's degree, I did my bachelor's degree in the University of Regina. And then I stayed on to the same institution to do my PhD, and that was mainly because I was really excited about studying insects and doing electron microscopy, and there was a wonderful person at the time who was at that institution, and I really wanted to further my experience there, so I stayed there and did mostly a structural thesis until such time as my PhD mentor said that I think it would be really cool if you could actually do some physiological experiments as well with your expertise that you have in insects. So I went to the University of Alberta for a year, which was even colder than the University of Regina. And I did a lot of physiological studies in the area of insect gustation, so how insects are able to taste. And I got a lot of experience being at both our one institutions. And then following that, I sort of looked for postdoctoral opportunities, and I was fortunate enough to be able to land one at the University of Arizona in the Department of Neurobiology, and that's an R1 institution. And it's a worldwide famous institution for the study of neurobiology of insects. So I studied under Dr. John Hildebrand, who is currently the Foreign Secretary of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And he provided a wonderful opportunity for many postdocs who were, I was one of 5 that were hired the year I went there. And we all got along really well, and we all were able to sort of share our different backgrounds and learn a lot from each other in terms of different types of methodologies that we were using to solve our research questions. So I had a great time there. And then at the conclusion of my postdoc, I was looking for opportunities where I could land a faculty position. And some of that, what I was interested in looking for was a geographical location that would offer opportunities as well for my then fiance. And so we are both in a very similar type of work in terms of working, well, he was working with insects at the time as well, and that's how we actually met, was in Arizona. But then he was looking for maybe being able to work with vertebrate animals, whereas I was sticking with mostly invertebrate animals. And so when the job opportunity came up at Towson, it was great because he was able to work many years at the University of Maryland and then move on to another institution in DC. So that worked out really well. And not only did I obviously carry out I started out as an assistant professor at Towson, and then I moved through the ranks to finish up as full professor. And I maintained a research lab that was interested in sort of focusing on animal behavior, animal physiology, of course, using an insect model system, and mentored many undergraduate and master's students, as well as published with them. So that was a really great opportunity. And then my teaching focus was mostly in the area of anatomy and physiology, advanced mechanisms of animal physiology, histology, and microtechniques. So that's sort of what I was doing. And then a couple years back, I took on an administrative position as associate dean of the college. And I was able to maintain my research lab, so that was a wonderful thing that I could do. And for close to 1 year, I served as acting dean in the college as well, while the current dean served as the provost in our institution while they were doing a search for the provost. So I got a feel for what it was like to do a lot of administrative, different duties that what I do as an associate dean. And that's sort of where I am now. So I hope to be able to answer a lot of your questions because I've been involved in a lot of job searches and looking at applications. So hopefully I'll be able to be a good resource.
Thank you very much again for being here, Dr. Shields. I appreciate that. In terms of format, the attendees who were participants in either of the previous 2 days of this virtual symposium will recognize the format, where we're going to start with a breakout group to give you a chance to interact a little bit with some of the other attendees and also respond to a prompt that's designed to get our conversation started. And that prompt, well, first, you'll have a chance when you get in the breakout groups. Please introduce yourself to the other members of the group, and then assign a recorder to come up with your group's responses to the prompt, which you should see on the screen now. I'll also post a link to the prompt in the chat. And we will see you in about 8 minutes on the other side of the breakout groups. welcome back to the main room, everybody. There's probably just a couple more people who are going to be trickling back into the main room. I'll remind you that near the bottom of your screen, you should see a menu option under reactions for a raised hand. I'll invite you to use that raised hand feature at any point throughout the discussion. You're also welcome to type in questions in the chat feature. We'll be monitoring the chat and incorporating those questions as we go along. So please feel free to ask questions as we go. If you were a recorder for your group, I invite you at this point to please raise your hand so that we can hear some of the insights that your group came up with. And Jake, I see that you had your hand up. Jake, would you mind sharing with us one of the attributes that your group came up with that would cause an application for a faculty position at a PUI to stand out?
We think hopefully teaching and mentoring undergraduate students and how you'd work and connect with them.
Okay. Dr. Goff, would you mind fact-checking that item from Jake's group, please?
Yeah, I think that that's critically important. In fact, that's what I wrote down as the answer for that as I was preparing for this panel. And I think that your point about undergraduates, Jake, that's really what, even though we have a very strong master's program here at Towson, what we were really looking for is that experience that goes beyond, I worked in a lab and there were a couple undergrads in the lab. We really want to see supervision, mentorship, and then also teaching experience.
Great. Very good. Thank you very much. And Julianne, I also see that you had your hand up. Could you share with us one of the items from your group that was an attribute you thought was important?
Yes, we had several ideas. Of course, we had the benefit of Dr. Shields in our sessions that helped. But I think one of the important ones that came up is this idea of demonstrating you as a subject matter expert in your field and having been recognized professionally in your field for the work that you do, either through conference presentations or awards or highly read publications or things like that.
And Dr. Mujoro, would you mind speaking to that, please?
Yeah, I think that's right. Demonstrating that you have the potential to, embark on an independent career that has the potential itself to then be successful and demonstrate products such as extramural funding and research publications, and then of course conference presentations. I think that is important. And I think maybe linked to that is sort of feasibility of the proposed work at the institution that you're applying to. So sort of doing a survey of the equipment and infrastructure that's available at that institution and ensuring that what you're proposing would in fact be doable there is sort of a second piece to that answer that you had. But absolutely, yes, I agree with you completely.
Thank you very much. Diamond, would you please share with us one of the thoughts from your group?
Hello.
Hello.
So we had those ones as well, but I think one of the ones I think may be unique is being adaptable and how maybe you were able to incorporate that into your statements. I actually don't know all the application materials, but if you can describe a time where you had to adapt maybe in person to online, like now, or how you overcame those kind of situations, what you did, and kind of just show how you can move through those different processes.
Dr. Casey, would you mind speaking to the role of adaptability?
Well, yes, that's a critical skill that we've all gotten to exercise a little bit more than we thought we would in the last year. So absolutely. And I think adaptability can be manifested in a number of different ways. And one of them is, as Dr. Sivey mentioned early on, well, I guess he mentioned it to us, there's been conversations, there's a spectrum of PUIs, from maybe small liberal arts schools up through maybe a place like Towson on the upper end that has a lot of research activity. And adaptability might be something that you're also demonstrating in how you tailor your application to the specific institution that you're applying to. So I think that's an important part. So there's adaptability as a skill in the workplace, and then there's also adaptability as a skill in preparing your application materials.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Casey. Brittany, please share with us thoughts from your group.
Yeah, so I just want to touch on service. So this was more of, I would say, a question in our group, was how much service, especially for someone coming directly out of, you know, a PhD or a postdoc, how much and what types of service would be expected on a CV. But our group was anticipating that some type of service to professional organizations or to our universities would give us a leg up.
Dr. Shields, would you mind commenting on what weight you might put on service demonstration on a CV for an applicant for a tenure track position at a place like Towson or a similarly situated institution?
I think I can speak for most of the faculty that are on our panel. I would probably put very little sort of consideration for the service component, because I would be looking more for their research and their teaching contributions, specifically if it was for a PUI. So it's not that I would discount the service completely, but I would look sort of at more of a focus towards those other components, the teaching, how successful they are in teaching, what kind of broad spectrum they have in their teaching background, and certainly whether they're going to be able to, as you mentioned earlier, that actually came up in our group as well, the type of research that the person would be doing and whether it would be feasible to that, like Claire mentioned, whether it be feasible to that organization. Can they be adaptive to be able to make it work? So the research or the service component, I mean, if they've served as maybe I don't know, grad student member on a committee for maybe some association or whatever, something to that effect, you know, that's good that they can demonstrate that, but that certainly wouldn't be a high priority for looking at a job application, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shields. And at this point, I just invite any attendee, you didn't necessarily have to be the recorder for your group, but were there other items that came up in conversation that you would be interested in running by the panel for their opinion on?
This is kind of related to service, but involvement in diversity, equity, inclusion. Almost every application I've had lately has asked for at least a 1 or 2 page statement. Curious thoughts on that.
Yeah, maybe Dr. Goff, would you mind taking that one?
Sure. Yes. So, and Jake, as you said, recently, you know, this is as you're probably all aware, this is very recent that diversity statements have been requested in job ads, and that universities like ours think very consciously about where is our diversity statement, and how is that embedded in the application that we're asking for that information. I do think that most universities are looking for a statement. In many places they request it explicitly. Sometimes I've seen it where it's sort of address this in your cover letter, so maybe not a separate statement. Those are tricky, I think. And I say this as somebody who's still writing recommendation letters for my former PhD students who are applying for jobs. So I sort of from both perspectives. I think when this all started, there was concern that people would write kind of boilerplate stuff, right? So it's, and this is true in teaching statements as well. I think this is just a hazard of writing statements, is how do you make it authentic, and how do you really express your own opinions and thoughts on these topics. So I do think they're important. I think that at least from my experience with my former PhD students from my previous institutions, particularly at UTA, for example, which is it's now a Hispanic serving institution. So students could talk, my PhD students could talk about, well, I was a teaching assistant in a class with a very diverse student group. I took this, I participated in a workshop of how to assist students in a diverse setting, you know, those sorts of things. So I do think if you have a few concrete things that you can say, that you've participated in these activities, you're interested in those. And again, I wanted to go back to, I'm not sure who said it, somebody said it, maybe several people said it, to tailoring your application to the place that you are applying to as well. Because I think you can learn a lot from looking through websites and figuring out, you know, what is the goal of the university in terms of diversity and inclusion, and what kind of efforts are being put forward there that you could potentially see yourself integrating with. And you can put that in the statement, right, that you would engage in those activities. So there's a lot out there on that topic right now. I do think it is, personally, I'm involved in this kind of work, and I think it's critically important. But again, I just say it's a little tricky. So I don't have a really concrete thing there, but just to have people read it for you also. And with all of your application, you always want to have someone else read everything before you send it out. And see what you can find that plugs you in. It makes you a little bit different. So it's not just generic boilerplate.
And I suspect, Dr. Goff, that's going to be one of the themes that we'll see in some of the advice that we're going to be giving is not only tailoring to the university, but tailoring to yourself, that the more specificity you can include in the information that you're presenting to the search committees, it's likely going to come across as more authentic and therefore be viewed more favorably. Thank you very much for those insights. Were there any other attributes from the members of the breakout groups that you wanted to run by the panelists before we step away from this particular prompt?
Our group did. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Julian.
Oh, okay. One of our members mentioned the fact that identifying actually interest in the success of the students within your teaching statement is important, and I thought that was insightful. It seems like it would be obvious, but I think it does point to something really critical rather than just, you know, some kind of more overarching teaching statement.
And Dr. Mujoro, would you mind responding to that?
So could you repeat what you just said, Juliana? It was breaking up a little bit, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. One of our members mentioned the importance of identifying an interest in student success as part of the teaching statement or teaching philosophy, very specifically, and I thought that was important.
Yeah, that's right. And I think you know, as Dr. Goff mentioned, looking at a place like Towson University, that is the mission of the institution. We are very student focused and centered, and ensuring that not just your statement, but you yourself truly feel like the career that you want to embark on at that institution is aligned with that mission will allow for you to put together a genuine and well-aligned argument for why you, and also down the road would allow for you to enjoy the work that you're doing at that institution. So absolutely, I think that when we evaluate, and we'll probably talk about this later on, I'm one of those people who think that the hiring decision is the first step in the tenure and promotion process. And having a commitment to student success is really an essential component of demonstrating that an assistant professor is a good teacher and a good teacher scholar.
Thank you very much. Diamond, I see you had your hand up as well. Please go ahead.
Hi. One of the people in our group also mentioned showing that you mentored undergrad and published with them as like in grad school or what have you. I'm not quite sure how would you incorporate that into your application materials? Like if you're just a grad student, you're unofficially mentoring someone just because you sit next to them in your lab or what have you. How do you say you help them, and then maybe you weren't even on the paper because you just helped them, so like you can't say my name is with them. So I'm not sure how you would like put that in, but I think it's important as well.
Dr. Casey, do you have any recommendation for how and where in the application materials that type of experience might best be communicated?
If you're applying to a PUI, in the cover letter, in your teaching statement, and in your research statement, I would make the most of that kind of experience. So if you've actually done work with undergraduates, you know, you don't have to overstate it, but I would make sure that you articulate clearly, you know, what that has been. If there are insights that you gained into working with undergraduates from that experience, then you know, that kind of interpretive stuff would be good to end up in a teaching statement or a research statement.
I agree very much with that recommendation. Thanks, Dr. Casey. Joe, please go ahead.
Yeah, one of the attributes that came up in our group that we weren't very sure about was this idea of commitment. Intuitively, we think that being committed to the institution should be important, but we've also noticed from the panelists over the last 3 days that there does seem to be more movement in PUIs than would be typical at R1 or R2s. So I'm wondering if folks could comment as to how important that attribute is.
Yeah, Dr. Shields, would you mind taking that, please?
So I have to ask commitment in terms of, can you be more specific?
I think we were thinking about it in terms of how committed are you to staying at this institution and making your career there?
Of course, you know, that is a sort of moving situation because, of course, you have to kind of see how things are going with when you start the position. But of course, I think if you can say that, you know, if things are working well and you know, your research is going well, and it has gone well in the past, I mean, I would say that it's important to state that you are committed, because of course, if you're going to say that, you know, or give any kind of indication that you may be kind of thinking of other options and maybe this isn't the right place for you, then of course that's going to bring up some red flags. So I think you have to be pretty confident when you're applying for the position that, having researched the university, that you can actually make it work there. So that would mean looking at your, you know, the research that you're doing, whether it fits in with what's available at the university, because lots of times, you know, you may be doing research on one particular aspect and it may not fit in at all with what the facility can provide at that time. So then you might have to kind of look at collaboration, which is actually something we discussed in our group as well, about being open to collaborations and saying, okay, given all these particular things, is that going to allow me to be committed to be at that particular facility? So a lot of things can come up and you have to kind of weigh the options and just sort of think, okay, given maybe these particular parameters that may be there, am I still going to be able to be fully committed as I thought I would be? And I think those are it's kind of a difficult question to address, but I think you have to weigh a lot of things there and be able to be honest in the application and just, you know, determine whether those are going to present a problem for you or not.
Thank you, Dr. Shields. Dr. Casey, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that really my perception is that moving among PUIs is actually probably more uncommon than R1s. I feel like most PUIs only hire at the entry level, at the assistant professor level, unless it's somebody coming in for an administrative position like a department chair or something. I feel like there probably is more opportunity for lateral movement among institutions at the R1s. So you might have had a subset of people who are particularly mobile for one reason or another, but I think that there's actually quite a lot of, you could call it stability, but also it's something to think about, is that, at least in my experience, I've not seen a lot of opportunities for people above the assistant professor level. And, you know, Claire can talk about that because she changed institutions. And even though she had earned tenure at her prior institution, came to a new position as an assistant professor. So mobility is something that's a little bit tricky. Commitment is one thing, but then also just understanding what your options will be down the road and what could lead to mobility if that becomes an interest is itself an interesting conversation.
And Dr. Mujoro, to that point, one of the things when I'm reviewing faculty applications that I'm looking for would be these sort of red flags that might suggest that for that particular applicant, their application to our institution is a backup plan for some other type of position. Would you mind speaking to maybe how that informs how you review applications and what types of things you might be looking for? Because this sort of feeds into one of the questions that came in the chat. And I'll actually start with the second part of that question that came in from Erica in the chat, which is, what are some attributes that cause applications to be rejected early on in the process? Would you mind taking that on, Dr. Mujoro?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I can start by saying, you know, when we on search committees receive application packages, right? The first, at least for me, the first thing I look at is I look at the CV, and then I look at the cover letter. And once you look at those two documents, it really does come across. You do have a pretty good sense of what the profile of this individual is. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to write a really good cover letter. This is where you're pitching yourself.
This is where you're showing that you're excited about the institution. And this is where you're getting us to be excited about you. And so taking time to put together, and it doesn't have to be long, it just has to, cover letters that are authentic will, convey that enthusiasm that you have for the institution. So I think that some of the attributes that will cause applications to be rejected early on, first, just sort of misalignment in terms of expertise. So if we're looking for an organic chemist and then, a nuclear physicist, just to make the point, applies for the position, that's likely not going to work out. So misalignment in terms of the sort of the background. And then the other important pieces are the proposed research. Again, putting together a research plan that would work for a setting like Towson University. So showing that you've put in thought into tailoring what you're planning to do for the equipment and instrumentation that we have available to us. And then also, of course, making it appropriate for undergraduate researchers. And then the other piece that I think is important are the reference letters. So having people who are going to vouch for your skills, expertise, compatibility with a setting such as a PUI is incredibly important. So, I think those are some of the things that come off at the top of my mind when I think about, attributes that bump applications to the top of a pile.
And I think I could just add one thing, and that is with the part with the references. I think it's important to also contact the referees that you're thinking of in terms of supporting your application and making sure that they do understand exactly where you're applying and the position you're applying for, so they can highlight you and spotlight you in the best possible situation. If you don't do that, then they, if you just say, can you write a letter for me? They say, sure. They really don't know too much about the institution. They don't really know what types of things to focus on. So I think that's an important thing, because referees are looked at in terms of, whether they're credible or not, and that sort of can really help you, but it can also really damage you too if they don't really address the right things. So.
And I think to that end, Dr. Shields, it can be really helpful if applicants provide a couple of bullet points to the referee writers indicating what you're hoping as an applicant will stand out in your application, so that the letter writers can echo those points that you're trying to really emphasize in the rest of your application portfolio. Dr. Goff, one of the things, and Diamond, thank you for your patience. I see you have your hand up. We are going to make your way to you very soon. But while we're on the topic of these factors that sort of stand out on sort of a first pass, first review of application materials, one of the things that I often pay a fair bit of attention to is how well are those components written? What is the quality of that writing? Because to me, that suggests, among other things, how likely is this applicant to be successful in their grant proposal writing? And so much of what we do in academia is, effective communication and writing. Would you mind speaking a little bit to that, and maybe some things that you've observed that either were done really well or things that were a pitfall to avoid when it comes to actual just putting the pieces together and the writing of these materials?
Sure, I think that's a really good point. The writing is critical in the style of writing, and it's, can you make an argument? I mean, you're arguing that you should be interviewed. That's your argument, right? There's something about you that fits really well with the university, and that you are going to be a successful scientist in your career, and you're a worthy investment, at least to get to the point of the interview stage. So it's really that argumentative writing that we're looking at. I was going to say, in terms of rejecting, one of the things that is the worst, and I know none of you will do this, but most of you will be applying to multiple jobs. And the worst thing for a search committee is you're reading through the cover letter. Like, I'm reading through a cover letter to Towson, and I get to the bottom that says, I really hope that you at Harvard University are going to consider my application, because you've been cutting and pasting and you didn't edit carefully. So that's why you want someone else to read it before it goes out. Get another pair of eyes on it. But I also wanted to come back to the question before about if you've worked with undergraduates, but maybe don't have a product to show, like a co-authorship on a paper. And Ryan made the point of put it everywhere. Again, that's skillful writing. You are laying the groundwork in multiple places in your application for why you meet the qualifications of the ad. And again, you want to reflect those qualifications. If it's a well-written ad, it should be clear. We want somebody with this background who can teach these classes, that kind of thing. And you want to hit those points. So I agree. I think the quality of the writing, the structure, especially research statements. I've opened research statements before that were 20 pages long, went on and on and on and on. There was no clear organization. That moves to the reject pile, because if you can't give me a sense of your research in 2 pages, then I don't know that you will write a successful grant proposal. And so it's that kind of thing of, again, thinking about how are you making the case for yourself and showing that you are interested in the university, and again, that you've done your homework. And I'll just say one last thing on that, because I'm a field ecologist. Years ago, a friend of mine said, any job that you apply for, make sure you look on their website and see what field stations they have, the university has. And I went on an interview, one of my first, right out of my postdoc, where I had done that in the cover letter, and I said, oh, I could imagine working at this field station. And every single person who talked to me during that interview said, I noticed in your cover letter you mentioned the field station. So that really goes to show that doing your homework and putting those pieces in multiple times in your application, it means a lot to the search committee.
And the easier you can make it on the search committee by emphasizing those things, I think, more than once, keeping in mind that the search committee members are reviewing dozens typically of applications, and often, to be above board, are reading material relatively quickly, especially during that first pass. You want to make the job of the search committee really easy when it comes to putting you in the pile that is the finalist pile, so to speak. Diamond, I see that you had the question in the chat. And Diamond, was that the same question that you were going to connect with the raised hand? I want to make sure that I don't miss any components there.
Yeah, I actually left my hands up by accident, but I still had a question, so. Yeah.
Yeah, Diamond, go. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering if it's appropriate to put that you like the location of the school. Like, I know that's a big factor for me. I think in one of our last panels, someone's like, I want to get away from the cold. Like, that's also, helps you decide where you want to work. Would that be appropriate to put in to just show you're excited about that too? I know that goes a lot for research with field stations and stuff, and maybe nearby governments, institutions, or what have you that you may collaborate with. I just want to know how appropriate that is to put in or not.
Dr. Casey, would you speak to that, please?
Yeah, personally, I like to see that. As a committee, we are trying to decide if somebody's serious about our institution and where we really fall in their ranking of the applications that they're sending out. As a committee, it's a risk-benefit analysis, right? As you look at an application, what's the risk and benefit of this person succeeding, of this person being really interested in us? So it was actually one of the things I put in a characteristic of a good cover letter. If you're interested in the geography, state it, because I find that helps us just to say, all right, we know this person's serious up front. And yeah, I think that's helpful.
Great. Thank you very much. And Diamond, did you have any additional questions to follow up on that?
Nope, that's it. Thank you.
Great. Sure.
I could just add something as well. I think it also shows that you've looked at possibilities for collaborations and so forth, so that in your research, if you want to collaborate, you sort of show the search committee that you've thought about it, and you've actually investigated, you've gone that extra mile to be able to investigate what's out there. So it actually, bringing back that question to stability, it would actually strengthen your application, in my opinion, because it would show that you've thought about it, that you can potentially collaborate, who those people are. You could even mention that in your cover letter that you look at possibilities for being able to collaborate with people right in the department that you're applying to. So if you know that there are certain people in the department that would be a natural possibility for collaboration, that may also be an important thing to list, because it shows you've thought about that, and it yeah, I think it would strengthen your application.
All very good insights. Thank you very much. And one of the things that we didn't fully get to that I want to go back to, although I think a lot of the recent discussion speaks to this question, which is especially noting that a lot of the hiring has become increasingly competitive, especially in light of the pandemic. What are some distinguishing attributes of candidates that you can consider what can really help these applications to stand out? And I think there's been some positive discussion about what some of those attributes are, but I do want to just invite from any of the panelists if there's anything on your list that sort of pops out that you've seen that really can cause an application to stand out that maybe we haven't touched on yet that we should address.
I just want to sort of share that there's some movement, I think, in search committees in the direction of considering additional attributes alongside fit. So the word, so oftentimes people talk about, does this candidate fit? Will they fit well in our department? Will they fit well in our institution? And while that does make sense on several levels, there is movement in the direction of complementing some of the strengths that are existing. So I see that there's a point here in the chat about, how do we view people who have, experience in industry, consulting, government, etc. So a candidate like that, I would view as somebody who's unique. So in our faculty, maybe we have more of the sort of standard academic track and don't have so many people perhaps who have spent some time in industry and gotten that sort of real world experience in manufacturing or whatever that they could bring to the department and mentor students who might be interested in those types of careers. So that's an example of somebody whose experience would be additive to the existing expertise that we have in the department. So I just wanted to mention that as we think about what types of, the portfolio of competitive applicants. So I guess, Julianne, I wouldn't view somebody who has those types of experiences as being disadvantaged. On the contrary, to the extent that you're able to make that argument, and that's to Dr. Goff's point about making that argument in the cover letter for why you, with this additional expertise that our department doesn't currently have, how you might utilize that to complement and enhance the programming and the support for the students that we're, dedicated to offering.
Can I add one thing to that? I think, Claire, your choice of the word complement is perfect because at a PUI, the departments are smaller than at an R1. And so I know one thing for us is we probably can't support, or it would be hard to have two faculty members who came in who did exactly the same thing in a department our size. Whereas you can imagine in a large size, you might have 3 or 4 people who work on very similar questions. But again, it's a matter of breadth and the number of students we have and the, all of those things that we're doing and that complementing. For example, we hired a lecturer a couple years ago who we needed somebody who could teach genetics and molecular biology. Well, the person we ended up hiring actually has her PhD in biotech. And she brought a whole, she can teach the classes we need, but she brought this whole other skill set with her, which now, which was really appealing to us. And I guess it also points to the fact that sometimes search committees don't know exactly what they're looking for, and so you can tell by the ad. Sometimes it's a really broad ad. It's a really broad net that they're catch. And it's basically we're going to throw it out there. We're going to see what we get. And those unusual experiences or different experiences can definitely make you stand out in those positions. But the important thing to remember here is that departments, and I know that this is hard, and it was hard certainly when I was applying for jobs. You could be, you all are all great scientists and engineers, I'm sure. You may not want to be at that university or in that department. Like there are things that are happening behind the scenes, and all kinds of things happen behind the scenes in searches. So one of my other messages whenever I talk to people at this career stage is don't get too deflated by rejections, especially now where the job market is so tight. I mean, the financial issues and constraints on universities right now, we as faculty, we don't know what's happening. I mean, people don't know. So there are so many things happening behind the scenes. So when the rejection letters come, which they inevitably do, it's, just remember that that doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't mean that you're not a qualified scientist. It just may mean that things are happening behind the scenes that you don't even know about, that there's something else going on.
And in my experience too, just to build off of what Dr. Goff was saying, when PUIs and similar institutions roll out a job ad, it's often driven by, or at least precipitated by, a teaching need in a particular teaching area. And in my experience, that sort of differs from an R1 institution where it's often going to be a research area gap that they're trying to fill or expand into a new area of inquiry that's primarily based on research. And at R1 institutions, I've had colleagues tell me when they were negotiating job offers at R1s and they ask questions about teaching, and then the search community will be like, oh, don't worry about that. We'll find something for you to teach. It won't be very much. Hopefully you won't spend too much time on it because we want you to roll out those grant proposals and get that Nobel Prize kind of a thing and get published those Nature papers. But Dr. Casey, is that consistent with your experience in terms of basically the job ad is starting at the point of a teaching need, and then there perhaps is a little bit more flexibility in terms of research diversification, so long as the applicant can demonstrate that they can contribute in that teaching area?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. The justification that allows the provost's office to approve a search for us is that, the person who fills this position is going to meet a teaching need for us. And then scholarship is something where we often do have flexibility, and, hopefully more and more silos are coming down, and, the strict subdisciplines are blurring, which in my view is a good thing. Often when we write job ads, we'll say that, consideration may be given to people who can contribute to our interdisciplinary programs or who can collaborate effectively with other faculty. So those are places where you can stand out. If you have a PhD coming out of a lab and you're doing nanotechnology and inorganic chemistry, you can apply for an inorganic chem job. But if you can start to say, oh, I can interface with material science people and I can do this and do that, then that can build that extra level of excitement that gets you past that initial screen.
And Dr. Shields, going to one of the chat questions that came up from Jake, is there a minimum number of publications that an applicant should have before applying for a tenure track position at a PUI?
No, there's really not, but the more the merrier, I would say. If you have a lot of publications, that's great. That'll probably be more convincing to the committee that you are more of an expert in your field, and I guess it would strengthen it. But no, there's really no specific number that you should have.
And then one of the other questions, thank you, Dr. Shields, coming in from the chat from Erica. What are some good ways of getting a feel for institutional and departmental culture? Are there ways to do that aside from looking at the website in order to gain an understanding of whether or not you're a good fit or can complement the department? Dr. Mujoro, would you mind contributing to that question?
Yeah, it's hard to sort of get your finger of the pulse of a department without actually going there, which I think, so there's the research that you do about that institution and department on the website that will give you quite a bit of information, and perhaps speaking to colleagues or asking around, you might, get a sense of what the place is like. But I think that you're actually getting to, this is where actually having an interview will allow you to get that kind of insight that you seek, right? So when you interview, remember that they're interviewing you as much as you're interviewing them. And so hopefully when you do land that interview, you will then have the opportunity to go to the places that you've applied to seriously, because on paper they match what you're aspiring for your career. And it really is at that point, I think, that you could get a really good sense of what a department is like. That might not be the answer that you're looking to hear, but I think that without actually being present, you really will not have access to that kind of information and insights.
Ryan, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Mujoro's response is smack on. I think one of the things you can look for, perhaps, to do that initial screen is the, are there internal collaborations going on that you can see in publications or something? You've got co-authors within the department or within or among departments at the institution. So that's the kind of thing you can find. But Dr. Mujoro's, really smack on that. To really get a sense of what the community is like, that's going to be something you're going to have to figure out at the interview. And if it's a stage interview where maybe they start off with a phone or a Zoom interview at first, they're all going to be Zoom interviews this year perhaps, but if it's an initial screen interview, it would be great for you to have a good, robust set of questions. And some of those questions can get at what the community is like. And you can often make the committee squirm a little bit, because often it's hard for us to characterize exactly what our diverse community is like in an interview setting. But I think that's a good thing to throw that out there and see how they respond to it. And I would say, just in general, if you're doing a phone or a Zoom interview, after the committee finishes the questions and well, do you have any questions for us? We ask the candidate, make sure you've got something. It's always underwhelming when someone says, no, I think I'm good, and you just end the call. So, get that list ready ahead of time and try and get a few things that you're fairly certain you probably won't hit during the routine Q&A going back and forth with the committee.
And to build on that, what Dr. Casey was mentioning, I found it very helpful when I was going through the interview process to make it a point to try to interact with, either electronically or in person, if it were an on-campus interview, with a faculty member in the same college, but outside of the department that I was applying to. Because sometimes you'll get more candid information if I'm talking to a biologist. So what's going on in chemistry? Like, what can you tell me about that? Biology faculty members were quite candid, as it turns out, about what was going on in chemistry, both positive and what some might characterize as opportunities for improvement. So speaking to folks across campus can be helpful toward that end. Were there other comments from any of the panelists that you wanted to contribute at this point?
Well, I would just say the other people to talk to on an interview is the students and the graduate students. That's where you often get, as many of you are graduate students. Graduate students can be incredibly candid. You have to take everything with a grain of salt. We were all grad students once. We know that can be it's meant to be a rough ride, I think, so you don't stay in grad school forever in some ways. But students can be really helpful. And if you are going to a PUI, and it's really helpful to meet with some undergrads. And the committee, of course, will handpick those students. But to get from the students, what did they feel? Did they feel supported by the faculty? Did they feel that student success is important for them? Because again, as Claire said earlier, you want your mission to align with the university's mission. And students can often be a really important way to get a sense of what is actually going on.
If I can just throw in real quick, we actually had an interview once for a faculty position where the candidate came in and had lunch with students and said to the students, in the end, I'm really not that interested in teaching. I'm just trying to get here to be able to do something with research. And all the students wrote it down in their notes, and immediately it came back as feedback to the faculty. And that was a really important part of the consideration for that candidate, who we did not hire.
Diamond, I see that you had your hand up. Please go ahead, Diamond.
Hi, so I guess I'm in a specific predicament that I think came up in the first day about being a grad student and you didn't really get a chance to teach due to fellowships or what have you. Would it be beneficial to do potentially an instructor position like in a postdoc or after a postdoc when it comes to trying to apply to PUI now that I already don't have lots of teaching experience and I'm already a fifth grade, so.
Dr. Shields, would you mind speaking to that question?
Well, I think if you're applying for a PUI position and you are expected to teach, then of course any teaching experience is better than none. So if you can find an opportunity to be able to get some teaching under your belt so that you are familiar with it, that's a great thing, because oftentimes when you apply for a faculty position, it's not written in stone, but they may require that you give a sample teaching lesson and just so they see how you are in the classroom. Like I said, that may be not the case in all institutions, but if it is, and you haven't got the experience of doing that, it may be really rough and it may be really unpolished. So I think if you can get the experience of having some teaching under your belt, that would be great. You're not going to be able to get that necessarily in a postdoc position, because remember, in a postdoc position, you're usually being hired to do research for most of it. And so any kind of teaching experience is kind of a top, like icing on the cake. At least in my case, I was expected to really do research almost 100% of the time. And any teaching that I would be able to do would be really very, very rare. So you're not going to get that teaching experience necessarily in a postdoc, but if you can get any kind of experience, maybe that would be, I think, would be helpful for you if you're applying for a PUI position.
And to that end too, I think things like volunteering to give a guest lecture is something that a postdoc would perhaps more likely be able to do than teaching an entire course. And one of the things that I prioritized when I was a postdoc was participating in symposia sponsored by the Center for Teaching Excellence at the university that I was a part of. Most of those centers for teaching excellence, they go by different names at different institutions, are open to graduate students and postdocs and faculty to be able to learn about pedagogy and to think like a teacher, even if you're not being an instructor for a course. Were there other contributions from any of the other panelists on that topic while we're here? Sure, Ryan, go ahead.
So, I certainly think that if you can get the bandwidth to try and seek out a teaching opportunity, even as an adjunct at a local community college or a local four-year or something, that stands out. And that there's a double opportunity for self-promotion when you do that. You say, I've been so successful as a scholar that I've been able to go through on these fellowships and I didn't have to support myself with TAs. But because I'm really interested in PUIs and teaching, I've sought out this on top of that. So I've certainly seen exactly that circumstance in applications, and it's really meaningful. Again, that whole thing that a search committee is evaluating risk and reward and potential for success, that indicates that this person is more likely to be someone who is a good match for the mission of our institution if they've deliberately sought that out, even if it means having to carve out the bandwidth to make that happen. And just also throw in, at Towson, we've actually got a program that runs through one of Laura's faculty in biology, where we bring in postdocs and try and give them teaching experiences. And so we're working with them and mentoring them. There may be institutions in your region that have something like that, or there may be faculty who are interested in mentoring you at a more PUI institution as you're a grad student or a postdoc, that might be able to get you really high quality experiences other than just jumping in the deep end of teaching an intro course at a community college or something.
Great, thank you very much. Joe mentioned in the chat on the topic of interviews, so I think now this is a great time to sort of pivot over to the idea of interviews. Are there any tips for giving a good model lesson by Zoom? It is always hard to lecture by Zoom, but especially for folks that have never practiced this format before. And I know some interviews will have a sort of a model lesson component or a teaching component to it. Other interviews that you might have may not ask you to teach a particular lesson, but are very likely to ask you to give a research presentation. That's customary when searches happen in my department in chemistry at Towson University. And that means you're sort of evaluated in two categories during that research talk. We're using that research talk to evaluate your teaching. And so if you're at a PUI, I suspect that that's going to be the case as well. So don't necessarily divide in your mind that, I need to put my teacher hat on at this point and I need to put my researcher scholar hat on at this point. During that research talk, you are teaching as much as anything else in my experience. But any tips for how to navigate the lesson giving or the research talk giving in the Zoom environment, things you've seen done well, things to avoid perhaps. Dr. Mujoro, would you mind starting us off there?
Yeah, I mean, we've learned so much this year about mostly what not to do or what doesn't work. But I can tell you with my sections of organic chemistry that I've been teaching over the past year, that breakout rooms really are a hit. So if you're giving a model lesson, using breakout rooms to demonstrate that you have thought through how to facilitate group work and discussion among students, I think will be a real asset. That, along with any kind of animations or videos that, so I'm not saying, like a 5-minute video, but really a short kind of video that might help convey a phenomenon or demonstrate a technique or something along those lines, also has been received really well. So, it's really challenging giving lectures and teaching online, but I think the challenge really is to avoid droning on and on and on and on and having a series of PowerPoint slides that people are looking at alone in their rooms with you going on in audio. So to the extent that you're able to break things up a little bit and make things interesting and somehow engage. And the nice thing I think about having this platform is, on the screen I can see everybody's names. So in my classes, at least, I routinely will call on students to ask them, even if we're not doing breakout rooms, but just to ask them to respond to any questions that I might have, similar to what Dr. Sivey is doing right now. So those are just, I guess 3 little points that I have on how to engage online when you're giving a class.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mujoro. Other comments from the panelists on this topic? Sure, Dr. Goff.
Yeah, I think that I wanted to go back to what you said, Dr. Sivey, a minute ago about Center for Teaching and Learning, because probably all of you are on campuses that have such a center, and those centers have all adapted to every faculty member now teaching online. So they probably have great handy dandy checklists, like how to give an effective Zoom lecture and that kind of thing. So I would strongly suggest you reach out to them. And what Claire was talking about just now, this in STEM, active learning is important. And so when I see someone interview, and if they are giving a teaching seminar in person, if they do things like they stop and they have learning checks and they're making sure students are with them, and they have some kind of way that students are responding back so that they are checking that learning, that raises then they just move way up. And it's not that we expect someone coming in from a postdoc to know all the most recent pedagogy, unless you're in science ed, of course. We don't expect that, but if you can take a few of those best practices that are well documented and backed up by research and pepper your Zoom talk or in-person talk with that, it goes a very long way, because what it says to the search committee is that you are open to ideas. You're willing to think about, am I teaching effectively? How might I improve my teaching, which is important. And I will just say as well, in all 3 of my faculty positions, I've been in biology departments. So huge, broad department. And when we interview, we might be interviewing a molecular biologist who is speaking to a biology department. And it is critical to know your audience, because as Dr. Sivey said, you are teaching. And often when I'm watching a molecular biology talk, the first few minutes I'm with the person, and then if they just dive straight into jargon, you can potentially lose a lot of your audience. So I think that thinking about the audience, how do you teach them, assuming they're not necessarily experts in the same field that you're in? That's if you're giving the research seminar, that's a little bit different. But as Dr. Sivey said, often the research seminar is the only one that you're giving, and you are being evaluated. How do you speak in public? How do you interact with your audience as you would do in a classroom?
And to build on what Dr. Goff was mentioning there on the topic of audience, if you're invited to do an interview, I strongly encourage you to clarify who your intended audience is going to be, because in some instances at a PUI, if you're giving a research talk, you should ask the search committee chair, what level should you be pitching this to? Should you be pitching it so that undergraduates should understand it, or should you be pitching it so that predominantly faculty should understand it? Because that's really going to change the way you tailor the approach that you're making there. Other insights from any of the past? Dr. Casey, please go ahead.
Yeah, and just building on that audience idea, if you are giving a teaching seminar, audience is critical. Are you guest lecturing in an existing course? Is it sort of a mock lecture in a format that you might have a mix of faculty and students? Is it a mock lecture where you might have predominantly faculty, department and search committee? Because if you're trying to do active learning and you've got a room full of old stodgy faculty, then it feels very contrived. But that's the reality, that some teaching seminars are going to be in this very contrived environment, and nothing you can do about it. You've got to know how you're going to keep that conversation moving forward. And if you ask for a response and there's this pause as all these faculty are sitting there, how do you keep it moving? And it's probably not a bad thing to practice with a group of grad students and colleagues who are simulating undergrads, maybe not so well. We interviewed somebody a year ago in person, and we had a couple of people, and one of them just did an amazing job in a teaching interview of keeping it moving and working with us. And it's almost like a little bit of performance art up there, where they kept the illusion that this was really a class full of undergraduates, even though it was predominantly faculty. It's a weird thing. And, our department doesn't usually have the teaching seminars, but if you have to do it, it's something to think about how you're going to fit in that situation and make it, again, keep it moving.
I was going to just add just a couple points. I think you need to think like an undergrad or a grad student when you're preparing a lecture, because that's key. The other thing is remind the audience, I think, as well, there's nothing wrong with saying when you're giving your lecture that I am targeting this towards an undergraduate audience or whatever audience it is, so that people that are not necessarily in the search committee know that the reason you're pitching it that way is because that sort of goes back on what Dr. Sivey said, that they know that you're pitching it that way because that's sort of what you've been asked to do, so that they don't think that, you're not capable of maybe making it a slightly different lecture, but you're making everyone clear that, okay, this is why I'm doing it this way, so that you can do that. And then also, I was thinking of the use of, getting off the idea of clickers, but maybe using your cell phone to be able to poll responses. Like, so if you ask a question during your talk and you want to sort of gauge the interest or the feeling of how the understanding is of the undergraduate students that you're lecturing to, there's nothing wrong with sort of using that kind of technology, because that sort of gets people knowing that you're involving the audience, and the audience is going to be pretty excited to be able to give their perception on a particular topic, and that's a nice way of being able to do it. So
I just want to echo one of the points that Dr. Shields just mentioned, which is this idea of at the beginning of your talk, stating for the audience what you were instructed to do as maybe a part of your outline, and say, I was asked to do, spend about this much time on this particular topic, maybe spend 10 minutes on my future research plans, or whatever that might look like. Reiterating that for the audience will be really helpful, for the very reason Dr. Shield mentioned, that not everybody and not every faculty member in that room is privy necessarily, or read the email that they were sent that they probably should have read, saying this is what we asked the candidates to do, so that you can demonstrate that as a prospective faculty member, you can follow directions. It's sort of a good thing to do. And along those same lines, if you're given a time guideline, and you likely will be, to spend, say, it might be coached in terms of 40 to 45 minutes total. That's not a suggestion. You need to treat that as with a high level of precision, because at least for me, if I see someone who's really missing that mark by, say, more than a minute or two, that suggests that you might struggle in the classroom when we need to end 50 minutes or 75 minutes afterward. And if you're not, you're going to be losing students. They're going to be getting angry. They're going to be late for the next class. They're going to become embittered. We don't want any of those things. So being able to do time management really well, and being able to adapt in real time to either technological issues that might arise, or if something's taking a little bit longer or shorter, having that amount of poise to be able to respond to that in real time will accrue you positive points in the interview process. Dr. Mujoro, did you have anything that you would like to add at this point in the conversation?
I guess we're going to, I think I'll hold my comments in anticipation of what you're going to do next. So thank you, though. I'll come back to you on that.
Dr. Sivey, I just wanted to jump in just with one more point, and that is have a plan B as well, because if you've embedded things into a PowerPoint, for example, and they don't work, you need to be able to be adaptive to be able to do something else. So for example, if you've constructed your PowerPoint or whatever it is, and then something doesn't work technologically wise, you can't have your mouth open and just say, oh shoot, I can't do anything else. So you have to have a plan B. So you really have to be thinking ahead of time, okay, what if this doesn't work well, or this doesn't work? Then, if you're doing something technologically that you don't know whether for sure it's going to work, then either, think about that. Either bring your laptop, don't rely on the institution's stuff necessarily, because if it doesn't work, you better have a plan B.
Absolutely. And Dr. Casey, would you mind tackling the question of what are some pitfalls to avoid when going through the interview process? We may have touched on a couple of them already, but have any other pitfalls come to your mind? And maybe to start things off, could you just briefly explain what are the typical components to an interview, maybe pre-pandemic and in the middle of a pandemic? What does a typical interview process look like? And perhaps comment on a couple of pitfalls you might recommend avoid.
So typical interview, again, like I said before, often it's going to be multiple stages, right? So there's going to be an initial screening interview that could be a phone call, literally a phone interview, or these days maybe a Zoom interview. And those are likely 30, 45 minutes, I think, for the most part. So Q&A with a search committee specifically. If you pass that stage and you're invited for a campus interview, or these days maybe an extended Zoom interview, let's say campus. So if it's a campus interview, then, we typically have people come in, we do meals with them. And our department interviews typically are about a day and a half. So, it starts on day one with breakfast at 7:30 or 8 a.m. and it usually ends with dinner at 8 p.m. or so. So you're on for the better part of 12 hours. And then the next day you might come back and do it again from 8 until, 1 or 2 o'clock. At which point we help you get to the airport or something like that. So that's a typical structure for us. A combination of things like certainly your interview seminar, meeting with individual faculty, maybe meeting with groups of students. In our case, we do the students often as a lunchtime. We give everybody some pizza and food and encourage you to sit around for an hour with the students. Meeting with administrators, dean, sponsored research personnel, things of that sort. And, so it's a lot of, in our case, it's a lot of half an hour time blocks with faculty, an hour here with somebody maybe, and you're on the move. So it's an energetic, get a good night's sleep. It's an energetic sort of endeavor. So pitfalls at the very beginning of the process, I would say one thing that I would strongly recommend is follow up with your references. Depending on the format with which applications are being submitted, if it's an electronic format that you get confirmation, that's great. If it's something where you don't follow up, because in some cases, search committees will not consider an application that's not complete. And I would say the most common reason for an application being incomplete is that a reference hasn't come in. And your PIs are busy, folks are busy, things fall through the cracks. And so I would say feel free to be a little persistent and make sure that those reference letters get in so that your application gets full consideration. And I would say, as far as pitfalls to avoid, we've been talking about the whole time, just do your homework and be prepared to be specific for the institution that you're looking forward to. There's a huge difference between saying, I could see myself teaching Chem 323 in your department, and saying, well, I think maybe this kind of course would be something I could do. And, specificity is going to really show off in a positive way. As a graduate student, I remember going to an open session with a candidate, and we asked the candidate, what would you envision teaching here? And she said, I really haven't thought about that yet. And granted, it was an R1, but it still was a really shocking answer. that she hadn't looked at what we offered to see where she might fit in with that. So yeah, I think, make sure your application's complete, and specificity certainly shows up as a positive.
If I could jump in on that, John, to add that I think, to Ryan's point about sort of the schedule of events and the time that you're allocated during the course of the day to meet with different individuals, I think it's incredibly important to be really well prepared and to know who those people are. I think for me, the best interviewers are those who come into my office for the half hour that they're meeting with me and have read up on my research, know what I teach, have something to say about how perhaps maybe our research, if they're in my research area, might be complementary. Folks who are able to ask informed questions, I think really shows that they've done their homework and that they're excited and interested to come to our institution. And then just a point about all of the interactions that you have with folks as you tour the campus are incredibly important. In our department, for instance, the search committee makes recommendations to the entire department, and then the department is the one that makes the decision about whether or not to hire a candidate. And so you may have had just 5 minutes or 10 minutes with a faculty member, yet that faculty member will form an impression, and that might influence how they vote to recommend the committee's decision. So just keep in mind that the people that you meet are forming an impression of you, and so no pressure, but and don't forget to relax and enjoy yourself throughout this whole process, right? I say that in jest. It's a tall order, but I think just to be intentional about interactions with the people that you encounter, right from the undergraduate students all the way to the dean's office, and sometimes beyond that as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mujoro. Did any other panelists want to contribute at this point in terms of pitfalls perhaps to avoid during the interview process, or things that have stood out that maybe have struck you in a positive way in the past?
Well, I would just say, advice that I was given that I give junior scientists too, are the things like bring a water bottle, bring snacks, and when they ask you if you need to go to the bathroom, say yes. Because it is grueling and you need breaks and you need to be able to do those things. And also, if you are in a situation where you need an accommodation, you need to be upfront about that. We interviewed a faculty member right after I got here, I guess about 5 years ago. She had just had a baby and she needed to be able to go and have private time to handle her milk. And so she needed that time, and she said it to us before she came. We made the accommodation and it all worked out perfectly fine. So, I mean, it is grueling, but if you need something and, it doesn't hurt to advocate for yourself in those situations. So I suggest that. But again, going back to what Claire said, you should get an agenda. They should send you an agenda with all the people you're meeting with, hopefully listed. So when you have those individual meetings, you can do your homework. You may find yourself in a room with 6 or 7 faculty, because sometimes it's a group interview and you may not know who those people are going to be. And so that's when having the well-prepared questions comes in handy, because you can't ask them about their research necessarily, but that's where getting that feel of the department. You can ask about, do people collaborate? Do people team teach? What are people, how do they recruit graduate students? Those sorts of questions that when you watch the group interact, that goes back to the question about how do you get a feel for the department. You'll pick up on that. People will react, and you can see, is there tension? Are there, are people supportive of each other? That kind of thing. So you can learn so much in an interview. And I think the other thing that's really important is you just need to be, even if because this has happened to me, even if while you're interviewing you think, this is probably not the right place for me. Like, you might come to that conclusion halfway through the first day. Don't show it, right? Just keep going. Keep putting your all in, because again, you don't necessarily know. You may have seen it, you may have just had a rough morning or something like that. So I really think the application and the interview, you are full in. And then if you get the offer, that's when all of these other things, that's the time to start evaluating perhaps other factors.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goff. And one of the questions on the subject of offers that has come in the chat is, how much leeway is there for negotiating contracts? And I suspect that this can vary quite dramatically from one institution to another. But Dr. Shields, would you mind taking that question, and what does the negotiation process look like? And what are the types of things that get negotiated?
Okay, so one of the things I was actually going to jump in there was, it's not going to be a good idea to bring up your hiring contract salary during an interview. So that's something that you really don't want to bring up unless it's brought up to you. You usually don't ask about that. The other thing is, as far as negotiating contracts, that would only be done when obviously you get that call saying that you have the position potentially if you want it, and then you're going to consider what sorts of things you need. So at that point, obviously the figure will be given to you in terms of the salary that you would be receiving, and that would be the point where you would start negotiating. If you think it's too low, obviously that would probably be the only reason that you'd be negotiating. So that would be the time to bring that up. And that would probably be the best time to bring it up, because if you don't bring it up then, and you think, well, I'll just bring it up when I get hired, that's really not going to happen. So you really need to bring it up when they really want you, the institution really wants you. That would be the time to bring it up. The other thing to negotiate would be startup. So if you're going to be doing a research, you're going to have your research going forward, and you need various pieces of equipment, and you don't know what pieces of equipment may be available to you to either share or to have already on the campus, because those are things that you usually don't know ahead of time. You really should have a startup document prepared ahead of time of your interview, so you know exactly what you need. And then you can basically say, okay, in order to be, come to your institution, this is what I would need. And you would give them a price in terms of your startup. At that point, the institution may come back and say, look, we appreciate what you've sent us. This may not be right at that very time, but it may be a subsequent call where they might say, well, we already have these pieces of equipment in place. Would you be willing to share? Or would you be willing to go into another lab in order to be able to use these pieces of equipment? And depending on what kind of research you're doing, that may or may not jive with whether that would work with you. So you're going to have to kind of think about that, whether it's feasible for you to walk across to a different lab and use whatever it is. So those would be sort of the considerations. So definitely don't bring up salary in an interview. Definitely when you do get the call, those would be the times to think about salary that you want. And then definitely negotiate your startup, because if you don't negotiate it, then you're not going to go negotiate it any other time. And you want to make sure you can be like your research is feasible and that you can be successful. So you need to have those things in place.
And Dr. Casey, you've participated in these phone calls as someone who's extended job offers. Would you speak some to, for example, how much flexibility or leeway happens? I mean, my sense is when like a startup offer is made at a place like Towson and a faculty or a candidate says, well, I'm going to need you to double that. The answer is probably going to be no, but can you help calibrate us in terms of what that process looks like?
Right. Well, let me start with the salary side first and just say that at least at a place like Towson, we tend to put our best offer on the table up front. So there's generally, for us, there's often not a lot of wiggle room for the salary. So under some exceptional circumstances, we might be able to do a little bit, but we are literally putting our best offer up front for salary. Startups a lot more flexible, and it needs to be justified. So the startup amounts that we've been able to support for our faculty vary depending on the faculty needs, and it's an investment. So at Towson, it's an investment that comes from the provost's office, the dean's office, and the department. So like it's going to take department operating budget to cover some of that startup. So we need to make sure that those expenses are really justifiable, because we are going to be putting resources into that we might want to put other places. So, but yes, you're not going to be able to double it. And at the same time, if you come in and say, yeah, I think I can get my lab up and running for about $10,000, we're probably going to come back and say, think harder about that. You probably need to be thinking realistically about the resources you need to run your program. And that doesn't happen often, but there have been a few times that I've been involved where somebody's really come back and had an unrealistically low startup. But also, when we make that offer to somebody, we usually give them a couple days to come back with a startup offer or a startup request and a justification for it. What Dr. Shields was saying about, having your startup request ready, that's a good thing, but then you're going to have maybe a general set of needs that you'll then need to add and subtract to tailor to the individual institution, depending on what kinds of facilities are available for you there. So have something to start from so you can turn it around quickly, but in all likelihood, you'll have a couple of days to go from that initial set of thoughts to something that's customized and justifiable for a specific offer.
Thanks for that, Dr. Casey. And one of the questions also that came in the chat was that some institutions ask how much you will expect to get paid on the application. Oh, that's new to me. None of the applications I fill out ever ask for. Now, industrial applications, I've heard of that happening. My sense in academia is that that's somewhat rare, but I'm open to be corrected by the panelists in terms of an application asking you to give a rough number of how much you think you should get paid. Any of the panelists familiar with that happening at a PUI? If you're curious, so someone posted, thank you, Joe, for posting in the chat a link to a salary database compiled from volunteer information from the Chronicle of Higher Ed. Also keep in mind that most public institutions, like Towson, for example, if you want to know my base salary, you can look me up. I am a public employee of the state of Maryland. But keep in mind, too, if you're relying on those, and that's a good resource if you want to sort of calibrate for things like the geographic cost of living and how that impacts faculty salaries, then for public institutions, sure, by all means, look at those databases. Those numbers are available. I wanted to go to the next question in the chat too, which was, what interview questions are commonly posed to PUI applicants that may differ from questions that are typically posed to R1 style interviews? Dr. Goff, would you mind taking that question?
Sure. So, I will say that having been at two other institutions that are R2s, but just for comparison, the teaching load at both of my previous institutions was 1 course a semester. The teaching load at Towson is 3 courses a semester. At some PUIs, it's 4 courses a semester. So although those were not R1s, they were more on that scale. The research expectations were much higher there. I think that when I got here, what I saw when we ran our first search when I was chair, was people who were applying, and in biology, people who needed, it kind of goes back to, does your research, is it feasible at the university? We had people who needed full mouse colonies to run drug trials. Well, we can't support that. People who need certain facilities and things like that you might find at an R1, you're likely to find at an R1, but you're just not going to find at a PUI. And so I think that aligning what you can do with the university is really critical. And to do that, hopefully before you get to the interview stage, if you can. The phone interviews that's one thing that we do in phone interviews, is try to get a sense of what is the person actually expecting. And when someone says something like, well, I was thinking maybe I would teach 1 class every other year. Well, that's not going to work here, because that's not what we're looking for. Teaching, for most Towson faculty, teaching is 65% of the workload. So, the majority of our time is supposed to be spent teaching, whereas in R1, it's minimal. Some R1s you teach 1 course every other year. I mean, it's that big of a difference. So I think that there are big differences in that. And I think when you are thinking about where do you want to be, what kind of day do you want to have, how much interaction do you want to have with students, that's where it really comes down to the difference between those 2 types of universities. And I will say, one of the questions that was posed was, why would you come to a PUI? Obviously, I've come to a PUI already as a full professor, having been at other places. And one reason I came here was because I felt that my mission had become, over the course of my career, very much undergraduate focused, and I could not fulfill that personal mission at the institution where I still was, because that was not what faculty were being rewarded for. They were being rewarded for grants and publications, and that mismatch. So again, I think but some people want that, right? And if that's what you want, if you want the R1 lifestyle, then you don't want to be applying at a PUI. So there are big differences there that I think you have to assess your own interests and then look at the institution and see what are they going to be valuing and what do they expect you to do for them.
And I think that speaks to a point that was raised earlier too, Dr. Goff, in that when search committees are reviewing applications and reviewing their notes on interviews, we're really trying to sniff out, if you will, those candidates who might be viewing that particular institution as a plan B. Because that's not likely to lead to the type of successful hire that the search committee is interested in pursuing. Other comments from any of the other panelists on that question of what Dr. Goff was speaking to in terms of differences between questions that get asked at PUIs versus R1s. If not,
I had the.
Oh, please.
Oh,
Claire,
I was just going to very quickly chime in that I had the sort of the reverse experience in moving between institutions. I started off at a mostly teaching institution. There was very little in the way of research. Not little, but there was less. There was less than what we're doing at Towson, and I felt that. I wanted to have more research, albeit with undergraduates and master students once in a while. And that's why I applied for the position at Towson. And I remember in my interview being asked, why are you leaving a tenured position at one institution to come, in untenured at Towson University? And that was my honest reason. I wanted to do more research. So I wanted to move from a bachelor's institution to a master's comprehensive institution. And so I think the interview process really is in many ways a soul-searching sort of odyssey. And it'll just, it'll become apparent if the position that you're applying for is one that is for you. And that is, again, a two-way sort of exploration. You're being interviewed as much as the institution is interviewing. You're interviewing the institution as much as they're interviewing you.
And Julianne in the chat asked, is there typically negotiating flexibility for what classes you teach? Dr. Casey, as someone who does teaching assignments for the Department of Chemistry, could you speak to what that process typically looks like? And is that a conversation that normally would happen during the negotiating a contract stage?
Sure. In a place like Towson, quantity of courses, historically not as much. We've not had as much negotiating opportunity there because that's something that's set for us by the state as to what their expectation is for the number of courses we teach. Now, currently in the state of Maryland, they're changing some of how we count that, and there may be some more flexibility in the future. So stay tuned. As far as which courses a person is going to teach, I think that a lot of that probably hopefully everybody's on the same page about that during the interview, right? So the candidate is saying what their interests are in teaching, the institution is saying what their needs are in teaching, and hopefully that's been a good conversation. I think that, to be honest, it's actually not something that's come up as a significant part of any negotiation with me. So I'm thinking hypothetically how I would handle it, but in all the negotiations I've had, it's not really been something that we've talked about a whole lot. Again, I would say, if you have thoughts about that, it would be great to hash that out as much as possible and get on the same page during the interview.
Thanks, Dr. Casey. And Dr. Shields, would you comment on what sabbatical options typically look like at our PUI institutions and whether or not that sabbatical opportunity ever comes into the conversation of contract negotiation?
I think less frequently, but it's not to say that it can't come up. I guess my experience has been that typically that has not been something that's brought up. But I think it's an important consideration because you should still know sort of what's ahead of you. So it's important to know that once you do get tenure, what are the expectations and what sort of would be the process by which a sabbatical application should be made. So I guess going through the process, asking at the interview, or maybe with the person leading the search, I think that's an important consideration. And then maybe knowing whether what the success rate is of getting your sabbatical request fulfilled, because it's not to say that if you put in an application, you're necessarily going to get a sabbatical that particular year, because it really depends on a number of factors, how strong your sabbatical application is, also how many people within the department are requesting a sabbatical in that particular term, so whether it be fall versus spring. So those are considerations, whether you'd be willing to have a fall sabbatical be converted to a spring for those very reasons, because maybe those parameters may be in discussion. So those are all things that I think you have to think about, and then also where you might be doing a sabbatical. So if you're in an area like we are at Towson, where there are neighboring institutions that may be able to fulfill your need, maybe you may not want to go that far to do your sabbatical. On the other hand, you may consider applying for some funding to support your sabbatical, so that outside of the given 4-month sabbatical, maybe you'd be able to supplement yourself by getting be successful in getting a sabbatical application funded, in which case it may be able to be converted to a full year. The institution typically doesn't give you a full year. So if you are thinking of a full year and it's something you really want to do, then you might want to investigate that.
Thank you, Dr. Shields. Diamond, I see you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Hi, so I think I have a somewhat specific question. I personally do computational/theoretical chemistry. So when it comes to like STEM and teaching labs and stuff, I know Dr. Casey, you were saying that typically people don't negotiate like what they're really teaching. However, how would you put that in an application that I don't mind teaching a lab, like I'm sure it'll be fine because I've done them in undergrad, but it's been since undergrad and I'm sure it will be quite a few more years before I would ever be in a lab. So how would you kind of bring that up without saying, I will not teach a lab? More like, I could if you need me to, or like, have you encountered?
We have a computational faculty member in physical chemistry, and she still teaches lab content. She teaches the physical chemistry lab. She teaches general chemistry laboratories. So, I think there's the idea that even if you've spent your graduate career doing predominantly computational stuff, you probably still have learned things about experimental design and data analysis. And like in our case, that's what we focus on a lot in our physical chemistry laboratory. You may have more skills than you give yourself credit for. And again, it goes back to that adaptability that we were talking about before. That would be a great opportunity for you to say, I haven't done a lot of lab work, but here are the ways I think I might be able to support some of your lab activities, or here are some courses that I might feel comfortable with. And that's where sitting down with that department's course catalog, you could be proactive about that and come up with those things where you think you could contribute. And then they can say, well, we don't need you for that. Or they might be really appreciative that you're willing to step in and be a multifaceted player in their scheduling and in their teaching.
Thank you, Dr. Casey.
Thanks.
In the few minutes that remain, I'd like to pose one more question to the panel that we can end on. And here's the question. What advice would you give to someone attending today who might be on the fence about pursuing an academic position at an R1 or doctoral granting institution versus a PUI or a comprehensive institution? What things maybe informed that decision for you in your process and what you've observed in colleagues as well? Dr. Goff, would you mind speaking to that first? And then I'll invite all of the panelists to contribute if you would.
Sure. Well, we have one molecular biologist in our department who did his postdoc at NIH. I think his PhD was at Hopkins. And he says quite frequently that one of the reasons he's glad he's at Towson is that he gets to go home every night and put his kids to bed. Because, and it depends what field you're in, but in many cases, the R1 lifestyle requires so much effort on the research front that in the previous lifetime, a lot of travel, not now, but there was that it feels perhaps more like a rat race, running the grant rat race, which we know is very competitive. At the same time, at a PUI like Towson, there is a research expectation. And so my faculty are actively seeking and getting, in many cases, grants, but it's not only a federal grant. So at many R1s, you have to have a federal grant in order to get tenure. At a PUI, at least here is my experience here, is we want to see you trying for that, but if you can support your lab, the key is, can you support your research lab? And it may be a combination of internal funds. We have several internal pots of money, state funds, agency contracts, those sorts of things. So it's not as constrained, I think, in terms of the requirements for that. I really think one of the biggest questions is, how much do you want to teach? I mean, because for me, that is the biggest difference for me, being here as opposed to the two previous institutions that I was in. Do you want to teach 6, 9 contact hours, 12 contact hours that you would at a PUI? Or are you more of most of my time is research and then I'll have one class every so often? To me, that is one of the biggest differences. There are struggles in terms of the research because you don't have the infrastructure at a PUI for research that you have at an R1. So there are trade-offs, but to me, it's the teaching. And certainly from the search committee aspect and the department chair of hiring people, those are the things I'm looking for in the application. Are you really serious about wanting to spend most of your time teaching and then doing research? And something that we haven't touched on too much today, but I just want to mention too, one of the things that I think makes Towson stand out is we have faculty who really integrate students in their classes through a variety of research approaches with their research lab. So there's this integration between research and teaching that I'm not sure you find at all institutions. So again, I suggest you really look at the university, suss it out, and maybe you should apply to both if you're on the fence. And ideally, if you got the interview, then you would learn which one you wanted. But just doing your research and talking to your mentors, where did they go to school? What was their experience like? Using your network to find out from others what their experiences have been like.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goff. And Dr. Casey, I have to admit that I previewed what might be a component of your answer in a previous symposium, which is a conversation that you've had with your faculty on multiple times, which is this idea of the delta when it comes to the impact you can have when a student shows up on campus to the time when they leave. And there's something special, I think, about working with undergraduates as opposed to primarily investing in the research experiences of PhD students that certainly informed my decision to come to a place like Towson. I get the sense that that also informs and motivates what you do. Would you mind speaking to that and any other thing that popped to your mind on this question?
Sure. Well, and that's a good point. I wasn't going to mention the delta, but I think that's also something to consider, even in the spectrum of PUIs, from small, maybe more elite liberal arts schools through state institutions, comprehensive institutions, which is what we are at Towson. So when Dr. Sivey talks about the delta, it's that meaningful impact. How much change can you make in somebody's life or career or trajectory? And at Towson, we're working a lot with a very diverse audience. We've got a lot of transfer students, a lot of first generation students, a lot of students that we're learning about now have huge work-life balance constraints. They're working more than ever. They're not just there full-time for 4 years to get an undergraduate degree, and that's the only thing they're focusing on. And that's becoming more common nationwide. It's not just us. So it's an amazing opportunity to make a really meaningful difference in somebody's life, and focusing on both on the teaching and the research side, right? So that's kind of something. It can be, I think, a more challenging environment to be in at a state comprehensive like we are, as opposed to a more homogeneous pool of students, maybe in a selective liberal arts school. And then the other thing I was going to talk about is, I remember once our sponsored research officer said to me, wow, I don't envy you all. When you all write proposals for research funding, you're competing with people at R1s who do research full time. And when you all write proposals to do pedagogy and things like that, you're competing with people that teach full time. And here, especially at Towson, where we've got this balance of teaching and research, we have to be competitive with both. We have to have our feet in almost like two different worlds. But at the same time, a lot of us come to a place like this because we kind of can't imagine a successful career without meaningful teaching opportunities, but also without having meaningful research opportunities. The small liberal arts might be more homogeneous and they might not have the research expectations, but if research is something you value, can you do more than just, student projects, right? So yeah, you can do some stuff with students, but it's not going to be competitive for publication and for funding and things like that. So just understanding where you want to be in that spectrum of more fully teaching, 100% research, and PUIs really span a range in the middle. The other thing is, and Dr. Goff touched on this as well, what you need to maintain a research program at a PUI is just quantitatively different than what you need to maintain it at an R1. And that's going to be both time, but also resources. And one of the things I like to point out to people is that I feel a freedom from my scholarship in my research environment that I don't know that I would have at an R1. And what I mean by that is that I don't have to support a whole bunch of soft money positions. I don't have to compete for whatever NSF and NIH want to fund this week. And I've taken that opportunity and I've pivoted my research because there's something that I just found interesting. I'm like, hey, I want to give this a shot. And often there are internal pools of money that can support that kind of exploratory work at a PUI and can get you on the road, maybe to eventually getting extramural funding for something. But you can't always rely on that flexibility and that freedom to pursue the questions that you're most interested in everywhere.
Thank you very much, Dr. Casey. And Dr. Mujoro, would you mind commenting on what advice you might give to someone who's on the fence between R1 and PUI?
As I said earlier, I came to Towson because I wanted to do more research, not less. And that's because I was coming from more of the liberal arts, sort of very small, teaching heavy institution. I think, to Dr. Casey's point, the flexibility in the research that I have is something that I really value. And I will say that the students that I've had work with me, undergraduate students and graduate students, have grit and work ethic. And we've been able to obtain federal funding for our work. And we've also been able to publish at the premier publications, journals in our field. And so I don't see those things as being mutually exclusive. And then to Dr. Goff's point, at the end of the day, long days, but we do go home and we do have time for families and other things. So I almost see it as a three-tiered system where you have, the R1s at the very top in terms of research, productivity, and then, really small liberal arts institutions. And then I think that a master's comprehensive like Towson is a sweet spot in between the two of them. And for me, that is my happy place, because I do feel that being research active and engaged outside the classroom really does enhance my teaching, and vice versa.
Thank you, Dr. Mujoro. And Dr. Shields, any parting words of wisdom to our participants today, if you would, please?
Well, I want to bring it up in the point of view of an R1, since we've spoken a lot about the PUIs. Having seen it firsthand on my postdoc advisor, I think what I'd like to say and contribute is that tenure is really determined at most of the R1s by the number of grants you have and the number of grants that were funded. And also research space is dedicated to that person also by how many successful grants they have. So if you start off with a research space that's X number of feet or whatever, however you want to mention its area, that space can be drastically reduced if you're not successful in getting grants. The other thing, just having seen that firsthand with, in the R1 institution I was in Arizona, the other thing is a lot of the research folks there were, it was important for them to get a grant, but then they also had to, for tenure, get the grant successful in the second round. So they have to resubmit the grant and get a resubmission in, and then get it, sort of be successful in getting at least 2 grants to get tenure. So that's very stressful, as you can imagine, because it's bad enough trying to get one grant through and be successful. I mean, in terms of the time and the huge amount of other things that go into it, but to have to get, be successful in resubmitting your grant and getting being successful in getting a second grant is a lot. Also, speaking to what Dr. Casey said, the research flexibility isn't going to be necessarily there as much. And the opportunity to work with undergraduates may or may not be, you may not have that opportunity as much as you would have in a PUI. So I wanted to bring some of those things up because those are things I've seen firsthand with my postdoc advisor. Also, one other thing was not being in the lab very much because of the fact that you're spending so much time writing the next grant, that you are basically spending a lot of time in the office. And if that's what you want, that's sort of what you're maybe you're going to experience, because you have to write that next grant. And so you're not going to have a lot of time to be in the lab and actually be there with students as much, because you kind of have to think about those things. So it's gonna, that's just things to think about with an R1.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shields. And to all of our attendees today, hopefully your participation this week helps you to inform the way you think about your future applications. I invite everyone to visit the chat at this point and extend your thanks, if you haven't already, to our panelists today, Dr. Goff, Dr. Mujoro, Dr. Casey, and Dr. Shields. Thank you very much for sharing your time this Friday afternoon with all of us. This concludes our symposium, not just for today, but for the whole 3-day symposium. Thank you again for everyone for your participation. I invite the panelists to stay on for just a few minutes, but have a great weekend, everyone else. And also want to extend one final thanks to Andrew Psoras, our technical coordinator, for helping to do air traffic control on the chat for me and keep my eyes in the right spot at the right time. Thank you very much, Andrew. Have a great weekend, everybody. Best of luck in your future careers.